The impact threw Elena backward, knocking the breath from her lungs as she crashed against the steel bars. Pain shot like fire through her ribs, blurring her vision, but instinct forced her to roll sideways as the massive paw slammed down inches from her skull, sending vibrations through the concrete floor. Bakari roared, a deep, primal sound she'd never heard from him before, as saliva flecked from his jaws, eyes wild with something Elena couldn't recognize. Scrambling to her knees, heart hammering violently in her chest, she raised her hands in desperate surrender, pleading silently, hopelessly, as the bear she'd raised like her own lunged toward her again, his massive shadow swallowing her whole. When Bakari first arrived at the sanctuary, he was more shadow than creature, a trembling silhouette curled tight in the corner of a small cage. His fur was matted, tangled with dirt and dried leaves, his frail ribs sharply visible beneath the patchy coat. The orphaned cub had been found near a logging road, abandoned and starving, eyes hollowed out by grief. From the moment Elena saw him, something inside her stirred, an aching recognition, as if she could feel the emptiness that filled his tiny frame. The sanctuary team tried everything. They offered fresh salmon, honey-soaked fruits, and warm milk, but the cub refused it all. He simply lay there, unmoving, staring at nothing, as though already resigned to fading away. Elena watched from outside the cage, heart aching with helplessness, until finally she couldn't bear it anymore. Without speaking, she quietly stepped inside, sat on the cold concrete floor, and simply waited. For hours each day, Elena returned to sit in silence, always careful to keep her distance, careful not to impose. Days blurred together into weeks, the room filled only with the soft rhythm of her breathing and the faint, restless shifts of Bakari's weary body. Elena said nothing, did nothing, simply existed, steady, calm, unthreatening. Then, one morning, something changed. The cub slowly lifted his head, his dark, wary eyes fixing upon her. Elena held her breath, afraid to move, afraid even to blink. The silence between them deepened, and then, with quiet, careful steps, the cub crept toward her and lowered himself, just inches from her feet. Tears stung Elena's eyes, but she stayed perfectly still, savoring this small, fragile trust. She named him Bakari, a Swahili word meaning hope. Day by day, hope became trust, trust became companionship, and companionship became a bond stronger than words. Elena taught Bakari how to swim, patiently guiding him as his enormous paws clumsily paddled through the water. She celebrated quietly when he stood upright for the first time, roaring softly in gentle pride. And when storms frightened him, Elena sat beside his enclosure until his shivering stopped, reassuring him through the silence they'd perfected. To everyone else, Bakari was a bear, majestic but dangerous. But to Elena, he was family, he was hers. She knew the pattern of his breaths, the meaning behind his gestures, the subtle flickers in his eyes. Elena trusted him completely. It was a trust born not from words, but from silence, understanding, and unconditional love. In the quiet days before the disaster, Elena began noticing something unsettling about Bakari's behavior. At first, the differences were subtle enough to dismiss. A restless pacing along the perimeter of his enclosure, the slow rhythm of his breathing slightly altered, his usually gentle eyes flickering with uncertainty. Elena watched closely, the uneasy sensation in her chest growing heavier each day. She knew Bakari's every gesture, every tilt of the head, every quiet sigh. This wasn't boredom or restlessness. It was a silent plea she didn't fully understand. She saw him linger strangely in corners, standing rigid and facing the concrete wall as though lost in thought or deeply troubled by something unseen. When she softly called his name, he'd only turn partway, his gaze meeting hers with a hollow distance that made her heart skip uncomfortably. One morning, as she approached with his breakfast, Bakari raised his paw slowly, holding it midair, hesitant and trembling. It was not a playful gesture nor a greeting. It felt like a warning, something desperate he couldn't communicate any other way. Elena brought her concerns to the morning team briefing, her voice tinged with urgency as she outlined the strange changes. But her colleagues only exchanged quick glances and gentle, dismissive smiles. "Bakari's probably just bored," one said calmly. "He's a bear, Elena." They all get a little restless sometimes, another added casually. Frustration tightened in her chest. They weren't seeing what she saw. They couldn't hear the alarm hidden within the silence. Determined, Elena carefully documented every odd movement, every unusual sound, and every moment of stillness that seemed heavier, darker than usual. She sent a detailed report to the sanctuary's behavioral specialist, begging for an immediate evaluation. The response was sympathetic but painfully casual. The soonest they could schedule an assessment was 2 weeks away. Elena's heart sank. 2 weeks felt impossibly long. Something inside her screamed that time was running out. The nights grew harder, sleep impossible, as Elena replayed Bakari's gestures over and over in her mind. She revisited security footage obsessively, searching for missed clues. Each review brought the same helpless dread. She knew Bakari was speaking through his silence, trying to warn her, but his message was lost on everyone else, drowned out by routine and disbelief. Each passing day deepened Elena's fear, yet no matter how much she insisted, no one listened, not truly. And in the end, the silence everyone else dismissed would become the loudest warning of all. The morning had begun like any other, cool air clinging to the steel bars of the observation pen, the sun not yet fully risen above the treeline. Elena moved through the gates with practiced ease, a bucket of fish in one hand, a bundle of fresh greens in the other. The familiar rhythm of her steps echoed softly as she approached the inner enclosure. Bakari was already awake, standing still near the far wall, his body a statue of muscle and fur under the soft light. He didn't growl, didn't pace. He watched her with unsettling stillness, his massive form motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his breath. She called his name gently, her voice meant to reassure, but something in her gut twisted. He didn't respond, not with a rumble, not with a tilt of his head, not with the subtle body language she knew so well. Instead, he raised his paw slowly, deliberately, as if trying to show her something. His eyes stayed locked to hers, not hostile, not wild, but impossibly intense. The gesture wasn't fast or sharp. It was deliberate, controlled, and it held a weight that froze her where she stood. In that moment, Elena hesitated. Her instinct screamed that something was wrong, but the depth of their bond held her in place. Then, without warning, Bakari moved. He didn't roar. He didn't flail. He lunged with terrifying precision, his entire body surging forward like a force of nature. Elena dropped the bucket and stumbled backward, the cold sting of panic flooding her chest as claws scraped against the concrete just inches from her legs. Behind her, the automated gate hissed and slammed shut, sealing her inside. Alarms hadn't sounded yet. Cameras hadn't caught up. And Bakari was no longer her bear. He was something ancient, something primal, and he was closing the distance between them with horrifying calm. Elena tried to speak, to reach for the voice she had used to soothe him since he was a cub, but the words caught in her throat. She backed into the far wall, eyes wide, heart hammering as Bakari towered over her. The cameras cut out seconds later, the screen going black, just as his massive paw rose again, not in warning this time, but in action. When the emergency team finally broke through the enclosure's secondary gate, the scene inside was not what anyone expected. There was blood streaked across the floor, smeared along the lower walls, pooled beneath the limp form of Elena crumpled near the feeding platform. Her uniform was torn open at the back. Deep claw marks slashed through the fabric and into the flesh beneath. One leg was twisted unnaturally, bone likely broken, her face pale and motionless as if she had been dropped there by some invisible force. But she was breathing, shallow, uneven, but alive. And Bakari was not standing over her. He was in the farthest corner of the pen, his hulking frame low to the ground, head down, body trembling with a shiver that seemed to reach into his bones. He didn't charge the staff as they entered. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He didn't move at all, just crouched there in silence, a mountain reduced to a trembling shadow. The keepers, still catching their breath, didn't know what to think. There were wounds. Screams had echoed through the hallways. Elena had gone in whole and come out broken, but something about the aftermath felt incomplete, unresolved. There were no bite marks, no tearing, The claws had struck once, maybe twice. Enough to bring her down, but not to end her, not to maim beyond saving. And then he had walked away. The behavioral team arrived hours later, questions swirling. Was this a territorial outburst? A failed attack? Or had something gone terribly wrong in Bakary's mind? But no answer satisfied the fracture now laid bare in the sanctuary's heart. Because it wasn't just Elena who had been wounded. The entire foundation of trust they had built around Bakari had cracked. And through it all, the image that stayed with everyone wasn't the blood or the silence. It was the moment when Bakari, crouched in that corner, slowly turned his head, not toward the door, not toward the threat, but back to the place where Elena had fallen. And in his eyes, there was no fury, only fear, and something that looked very much like regret. In the days following the incident, the sanctuary was gripped by a tense and uneasy stillness. Every available resource was mobilized. Surveillance footage was pulled from every angle, slowed down, zoomed in, and analyzed frame by frame. Vets examined Bakari for signs of illness, hidden injuries, neurological issues, anything that could explain what had happened. Behavioral specialists combed through weeks of daily logs, comparing routine patterns, environmental conditions, and interactions with staff. But no matter how deep they searched, nothing added up. There was no record of mistreatment, no environmental disruptions, no history of aggression. Bakary's health charts were clean. His vitals were stable. His nutrition had been consistent. There was no clear trigger, no spark to ignite the explosion. On paper, it didn't make sense. And yet, Elena lay in a hospital bed, broken but breathing, while the bear she once trusted now sat under constant watch, separated from the world behind reinforced glass. Still groggy from painkillers and surgeries, Elena demanded to see the footage herself. She watched it over and over, each time her eyes narrowing not in fear, but in deep, haunted thought. She knew Bakari hadn't acted out of rage. She knew him. His eyes in those final moments weren't wild or hostile. They were pleading. He wasn't attacking. He was asking. For something. For help. Then, during the 10th or maybe 11th review, she stopped the tape. There it was, just before the charge. The raised paw. Slow. Deliberate. Almost identical to the gesture she had seen weeks earlier during a medical sedation procedure that had gone briefly, terribly wrong. The tranquilizer had missed its mark and sent Bakari into a confused, panicked frenzy. That time, too, he had raised his paw in the same strange way before collapsing. It wasn't a gesture of threat. It wasn't aggression. It was something else. A signal. A memory. A flash of pain returning in a way only he could feel, but couldn't explain. Elena's voice cracked as she whispered the realization to the attending specialist. He had remembered. The pain. The helplessness. He had warned her in the only language he knew. Not with words, but with silence. And a single raised paw. Days after the attack, just as the behavioral theories were starting to go in circles, one of the senior veterinarians made a final request. An advanced full-body scan of Bakari. One more chance to find what the blood work and physical exams had missed. It wasn't standard procedure, but the unease lingering in the team's silence was growing too loud to ignore. The results arrived 2 days later, and what they revealed shifted everything. Deep in Bakary's jaw, buried behind thick bone and muscle, an infected molar had rotted unseen. The tooth had cracked near the root, and infection had spread beneath it, pressing against a major nerve. The pain would have been constant, throbbing, sharp, like a dagger lodged inside his skull. But worse than the pain itself was its invisibility. Bakari couldn't point to it. He couldn't explain it. He could only endure it. And over time, that kind of agony doesn't just hurt. It distorts. It changes everything. The specialists concluded that the infection had likely been building for weeks, perhaps longer. Every head tilt, every pause in the corner, every lingering paw raised mid-air wasn't strange behavior. It was the only way he knew to say something was wrong. The attack, as violent and terrifying as it appeared, had not come from a place of malice. It had come from desperation, not rage, but suffering. When Elena was told, she didn't cry. She closed her eyes and simply sat in silence, nodding slowly. She had known it, somewhere deep down. She had felt his confusion and fear in those final moments, not as a zookeeper reading behavior, but as someone who had once sat beside a dying cub and listened to his silence until it spoke. He hadn't turned on her. He had come to her, the only soul he'd ever trusted, the only one who had ever heard him before. In his moment of overwhelming pain, when he could no longer bear it, he reached for her, not to harm, but to plead. And the world had misread him. The blood, the screams, the scars, they weren't marks of betrayal. They were the cost of not listening soon enough. The hospital room was quiet except for the hum of machines and the soft rustle of blankets when Elena shifted in pain. Weeks had passed since the incident, but her wounds still ached with every breath. The physical healing was slow, but it was the silence inside her that hurt most. She refused visitors. Nurses came and went, but she spoke to no one. Her eyes stayed fixed on the small screen by her bed, where she played the footage over and over again, Bakari's paw raising slowly, his eyes searching hers, the moment before everything went wrong. She didn't flinch watching it. She didn't weep. Instead, she studied it like a sacred message she had failed to understand. Again and again, she paused on that single frame, where the bear stood in stillness, caught between instinct and agony. "He asked for help," she whispered once, voice barely audible, as if saying it aloud might rewrite the past. Not with anger, not with blame, just sorrow, profound and soul-deep. When she was finally strong enough to sit upright for more than a few minutes, she asked for a pen. With trembling fingers, she wrote a letter, addressed not to the public, not to the press, but to the sanctuary's board of directors. In it, she explained everything, what she had seen, what she had missed, and what she now understood. She described Bakari's pain, the signal no one else had seen, and the truth behind his so-called attack. And then she wrote a single plea. "Do not put him down. He was not trying to kill me. He was trying to find me. Please, let me come back to him." She signed it with her full name. And beneath that, one final line: "I still believe in him." In a world that moves fast and talks louder each day, it's easy to miss the voices that don't use words. We're trained to look for roars, to respond to the obvious signs of danger or distress. But sometimes, the most urgent cries for help come dressed in silence. Bakari was not a threat. He was in pain, overwhelming, blinding pain that stripped away his ability to exist peacefully in his own skin. And Elena was not careless. She was listening. She had always listened. But this time, the message came in a language even she hadn't fully learned to understand. Because pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it lingers behind tired eyes or curls into the corners of a cage. Sometimes it raises a paw instead of a voice. Sometimes it doesn't look like pain at all until it's too late. Yet even in the aftermath, even after blood and fear and hospital walls, something endured. What nearly broke their bond didn't end it. It reshaped it. Stronger, quieter, more fragile, but more real. Now they exist in a new space, one built on deeper trust, one where gestures are enough, where silence carries meaning, where both know that the language of love is not always spoken aloud. Bakari had asked for help the only way he could, and eventually someone heard him. That truth doesn't erase the pain, but it redeems it. It transforms what happened into something more than tragedy. It becomes a lesson, a reminder that the most important things are often said without saying anything at all. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you powerful true stories from the wild, where trust is fragile, pain speaks softly, and understanding can change everything. Every like, comment, and share helps amplify voices like Elena's and like Bakari's. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never stop listening for the things that aren't said out loud.